Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning and good evening. Apologies, there have been some technical problem in terms of sharing the screen. I hope you are able to hear me at this point of time. So, welcome to this webinar on Knowledge Commons, Legal and Policy Issues, which is jointly being presented by myself, Balakrishna Pisapati, the chairperson of not-for-profit trust based in India called Forum for Law, Environment, Development and Governance, FLEDGE, jointly with Foundation for Ecological Security based in Anand, Gujarat. The Foundation for Ecological Security focuses on the issue of promise of commons, and I've had long-standing experience working on the issue of commons in India and also in the region. And this particular presentation focuses on the issue of knowledge commons. There we also will be discussing elements of a report that was launched on the 13th of February in India on the same topic in terms of clarifying the issues of knowledge commons and what are the legal and policy issues related to furthering our work and understanding on knowledge commons. This session is being recorded and the recording will be made available to all those interested later. And for those of you who actually are not familiar with the differentiation or understanding knowledge and knowledge commons, I'd like to briefly explain that knowledge is familiarity, awareness, or understanding of someone or something, such as facts, information, descriptions, or skills, which is acquired through experience or education by protecting, discovering, or learning. Knowledge can refer to a theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. Whereas knowledge commons refers to shared intellectual, cultural, and information resources, including inventions, creations, data, and so on. And the work related to knowledge, or generally commons, runs back to several years. And the most important and seminal work has been that of managing natural resource commons by a famous economist who also won a Nobel Prize for her work on the issue of commons, Dr. Elinor Ostrom. And currently, there is an enormous amount of scholarship that is available in terms of study of commons through the International Association for the Study of Commons, as well as several individual experts and organizations who actually focus on issues related to commons from different perspectives. As I mentioned, since the work on commons has been there for a long time, and knowledge commons is also a topic that has been discussed for quite a few number of years, essentially in the last 10 years or so, we are able to gather some elements of lessons we have learned from the work that has happened so far, and also have had some results in terms of the work that has emanated from the work on knowledge commons. And a few of those results include the understanding that knowledge creation, curation, distribution, and use is based on demand. It can also be based on supply, but it also can be based on demand and supply as well. And the second result that had emanated from the work on knowledge commons is that it can be clustered or it can also be nested. But most importantly, knowledge common depends on shared information. And this actually is the core for today's discussion in terms of the report and the elements of the report my colleague will present in a few minutes, where we actually look at how information related to one particular component of commons, essentially biological diversity of biological resources and associated traditional knowledge, is currently being handled, understood, and applied both in terms of action as well as in terms of policy, and how sharing that information is so very important for us to achieve not only our goals of sustainable management of the resource, but also to achieve sustainable development using both the knowledge as well as the resources. And another key result of the work that has happened in Knowledge Commons thus far is an indication that the informal governance institutions are very important for Knowledge Commons to progress. But what is important within those institutions is to have trusted leadership. And that trusted leadership plays a very, very important and a key role in terms of ensuring appropriate governance, both in terms of managing the knowledge and also Knowledge Commons. And Knowledge Commons also depends on a number of motivations to cooperate. It cannot be just about one individual with one set of activities that can essentially give an impactful result. And lastly, and most importantly, the state plays a very, very important role in defining actions. Because as I said, that even though a lot of this work happens at the local level on the ground, both in terms of knowledge management, creation, curation, distribution, unless this is supported by appropriate policy and legal information, legal instruments and support systems, the impact of using Knowledge Commons has always been a bit of a difficulty. As far as today's webinar is concerned, we'll be focusing on two key components with respect to Knowledge Commons. One, what are the issues related to privacy and confidentiality as knowledge governance component when you're talking of data and information related to biodiversity? Secondly, the role of entrepreneurial history of shared social infrastructure. And many of you are aware of the increasing influence and the role social media and social infrastructure is playing in our lives today, not only in terms of governance, but also in terms of decision making, in terms of having impacts on the ground. So we did actually undertaken some research in terms of understanding how we can go about doing this. Hello? So if you're looking at natural resource management Knowledge Commons, we are looking at knowledge as a non-depletable, non-excludable resource. But what is important to also understand is that it is often depletable with the material attributes that comes with it. So that's an important aspect that we need to have in mind. And if one is looking at the current governance of natural resources, especially ecosystems and biodiversity, we can look at these from three different perspectives. One, an international perspective, and that international perspective, for example, one example I have taken is related to the Convention on Biological Diversity, including its Article 8J on traditional knowledge. The national elements that looks at issues of sovereignty and equity, both in terms of the resources as well as associated traditional knowledge, and the local components that look at the common property management that many of you probably are already aware of or practicing. So the question that we are asking ourselves at this point is that can the principles and approaches of knowledge management or Knowledge Commons shape the future of ecosystems and biodiversity agenda at different levels, at the local level, at the national level, and also at the international level? And these questions are some which we have tried to answer through a publication, as I mentioned, that was launched, jointly authored by my colleague Shyama Kuriakose, who is going to be taking over from me in a few minutes in terms of pushing forward that particular agenda. And the report is titled as Knowledge Commons, Current Issues Related to Natural Resources and Biodiversity. And with that, I invite my colleague, Ms. Shyama Kuriakose, to take over and get on with the presentation that explains the elements of the report. Shyama, you have it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning. I thank FLEDGE and FES for this opportunity. I'll now begin with the background of the report, which was headed by FES and FLEDGE. Basically, there was a need that was felt to undertake a comprehensive legal assessment on the data and information related to biodiversity and associated knowledge. And this is basically due to the fact that there is currently nothing as such available in India with regard to an assessment on the data part of it, which is why there was this need felt. So the report are covering the following issues, which are, we've covered a lot of case studies and a lot of instances from around the world where countries have come up with legal regimes as well as There are mapping exercises that have taken place. So we have tried to record those instances. Second thing that we do is to look into the IPR regime, especially when it comes to data on biological resources and associated traditional knowledge. Related to this is the common misunderstandings and apprehensions with regard to the Biodiversity Act and the Patents Act. So we have covered all of these issues intermingling between these two legislations. We are also talking about a few important case studies on the need for open access. So we have referred to some international decisions here to show why access to biological data or knowledge commons should be open. And last of all, we then bring out what are the policy practice recommendations, what can be done to free up the data in a qualitative and efficient manner. So as we all know, data is considered as the next oil of our times. With the advent of technology, with the advent of the internet age, there is so much of data out there, and governments as well as private sector really consider this to be something that can be mined for profitable purposes. But when you look, that is from one aspect of it, and then there is the aspect of the public purpose of such data, where this is going to be really useful for everybody, and which is why this term oil is quite important in this context. But data cannot just be simply data. It has to be good quality, it has to be useful, it has to be transparent, and that is where governance will really play a good role when data, good quality data is concerned. So there are, and this will also help to overcome a lot of the environmental challenges which are facing this world, both the developing as well as the developed countries. Currently, what's happening is this open access is wrought with a few challenges, and the first of it being lack of information. That is, the important information that's required is not accessible. Either it belongs to the government and they have a closed ownership over it, or else it belongs to private sector. So what is useful is not available. Next is the technical know-how that is there to gather all this data and make sure that it's efficient. So that, especially with developing countries like India, that sort of know-how is missing in a general context. And thirdly, the lack of safeguards so as to prevent theft or misappropriation of such a data. Next. So when we talk about data, it's very important to consider what Kenneth M. King mentioned about the justification for such an access to environmental data. There are four key principles that he brought about. First is that every scholar in the world should be connected to every other scholar. Secondly, all the important information that's out there, which is worth sharing, should be available. Thirdly, the database that is supposed to be there should be collaborative and dynamic in nature. And fourthly, this system should be easily navigable and manageable. So now we come to the part where we discuss what are the benefits for open access. There are several benefits to the same, especially when it comes to environmental data. The first one is that there are direct economic benefits to the countries which practice it. So, for instance, if you look at countries like US and UK, there is a big type of information that's available on weather patterns, and there are a lot of private and public meteorological services which are benefiting from such availability of data, and there are economic benefits that are driven through that. Secondly, it is beneficial for the citizen and for a government's day-to-day decision making, because if information is available, it's easier for both parties to make those. If data is available, it's easier for decision making. There'll be increased trust in national institutions because the data that is used for taking those decisions are openly available. Thirdly, it helps with promoting local innovations with youngsters, entrepreneurs, because there is so much of information that's already out there. And obviously, the next one is that there are direct and social benefits to communities. Now, this is a very important part because we can see how a lot of indigenous communities are losing the precious knowledge that they've preserved and used for centuries. Documenting the same could prevent the loss of such data, as well as helping them economize that information that they have. Next. And obviously, in the international law perspective, making environmental data freely accessible is in public interest. This is as per the United Declaration for Human Rights. Then it also leads to efficiency, transparency, and reproducibility, and it reduces uncertainties and duplications. In regard to environment degradations, the various aspects that it can help with is that it can help with protection of biodiversity and endangered species from extinction. It can help with data around water and food security. And in case of epidemics, it can really help gain new grounds. And this can also help with short-term and long-term responses to natural disasters. Next. Having covered what the benefits are, now it's vital to look at what India has done with respect to its preparedness for open access. There are some very good examples for how India has gone into this field. So, for instance, there are excellent initiatives by the IMD and ISRO with regard to creating satellite-based land data on various aspects of temperature, rainfall, even upcoming events, climatic events. Then there are also informations available under these databases on the existing species, fauna, flora, which is all across the country. And all of this information is satellite based. Added to that, there is also the MOEF, the Ministry of Environment and Forest of India, its initiative, which is the Environmental Information System, wherein a lot of the information that I mentioned above is available publicly, both at the national as well as the state level. So it goes down to a local level as well, that information that's available. The third great initiative is the creation of a traditional knowledge digital library by the Ministry of Ayush, wherein it's a big database of the traditional medicinal systems such as Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, etc., which is available, which is documented within this library. In fact, it's digitized in such a way that it's available for the future, and it can also be accessed by international patent offices when it comes to any patent that's slightly related to traditional knowledge. Next of all, that India is a participant in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, wherein all the data that it possesses on biodiversity is available in this particular forum. So as you can see, there is a lot of attempts. There are a lot of good attempts, and in fact, attempts like TKDL, or Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, is lauded all across the world. But what can be observed is that there is no concerted attempt by the Indian government to validate these databases and bring them all under one umbrella. It's often seen that in the Indian context that there is a real dearth of good quality information due to several reasons. First of all is that the way in which records are maintained by the government institutions are quite flawed and faulty. There's often a lot of loss that happens. Next is that there is patchy information on aspects such as biodiversity, traditional knowledge, and groundwater. Mainly because of the spread of this information, the extent of this country. So information from every minute local area is yet not available. Thirdly, of course, is the suppression and falsification of environmental data for vested interests. This often comes when there are projects, there are development projects which are requiring such data, and it's often seen that the information is flawed or mistakenly given. Next is that public participation in getting such information is also reduced. There is no, the public is not allowed to get these informations. Usually they have to use the route of the Right to Information Act, but even there is a major difficulty. There are often a lot of hurdles. And of course, there is the failure to make this information publicly available. Having discussed what is there on the ground, it's important to now look at what are the law and policy measures which deal with the subject. Most important of all is the National Data Sharing and Accessibility Policy of 2012, which governs public access to government-owned shareable data. So basically, any data that's been created by the government through public funded money is legally mandated to be publicly available to everybody. The government cannot keep it under lock and key, and that is what this policy says. It also goes on to say that the information that's available under one ministry or one agency belongs to it, but the Department of Information and Technology is the nodal department which will guide access to this information available in various agencies. That's the policy. Next of all, there is the Act, the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, uh, which talks about the documentation of bioresources and associated traditional knowledge through people's biodiversity registers. This is the only law as such which talks about documentation of such resources, and there is no other law which mandates the same. There are obviously mandates with line departments like forest departments or the panchayat, the local self-governments who have to prepare working plans, management plans or micro plans, coastal zone management plans. These, even though they don't have a lot data with regard to the physical aspects of that place, they still contain data that's useful for decision making, which is why I have mentioned the same here. Next. Then there is a lot of international instruments on which talk about the need for access to environmental data. So if you look at the ICCPR of 1966, the freedom of right to expression has been connotated with the freedom to receive information. And the Stockholm Declaration of 1972 said that research regarding all aspects of environment should be free flowing. The Rio Declaration of 92 talks about the need for cooperation between parties through exchange of scientific and technical knowledge. The CBD of 92 is particularly relevant because it has established a clearinghouse mechanism where all the information that's going between countries, the activities, they're all described and they're all documented within this clearinghouse mechanism, which is accessible to anybody who goes on the website. The Aarhus Convention of '98, which is something that was done in the European Union, also promotes access to information, public participation, decision making. And this same sort of convention was promulgated in the Latin and Caribbean countries as well in the form of the Escazú Agreement of 2018. This is very recent. So all of these international instruments that are available talk about the right to receive information and the duty on the states to make this information publicly available. So then we went on to look at some case studies as to what's happening in a few countries with regard to open access. So the biodiversity law of Brazil is important because it talks about it highlights the need for research and information from databases, how that information can lead to more innovation, and it really stresses on that within the law. Even in the Costa Rican law of '98, there is a lot of priority given to research and participation in decision making by communities, which cannot be possible without access to the information. In the European Union, there are some databases which are created. It's called the Natura 2000, which is an open access database. In Philippines, there is a new guidelines which have come. Like in 2012, there were guidelines on how customary law and indigenous knowledges, etc., should be documented, and what are the dictates. How is it that this information can be kept from misappropriation? All of these aspects are covered in these guidelines. The country also came out with a freely accessible TKDL for health. Then there are some best practice examples that we found. So in Belize, there is this exercise done by the communities in Belize, the traditional communities, who have documented data on flora, fauna, soils and geology, hydrology, and their socio-economic situation and their indigenous traditional knowledge. This has been compiled by the community themselves for future purposes. In Australia, the Tanami region, here also a data set on the available fauna, flora, and the traditional knowledge have been collected, and they're available to anyone who wants to access them. The Pacific TK database is very interesting because this has been done. This is an initiative by the governments in the Pacific area who are faced with constant disasters, especially weather and climate related disasters. So they have collected information from the communities on the traditional knowledge on how to identify the outset, how to the mitigation and the post-disaster management. So this database is also openly accessible. South Africa and Ireland have also done similar projects. Uh, so we have also thrown some light on the need for information as to why it is that this information is required. So as you can see in the first case of Gura versus Italy, no information was given to the public on a chemical factory, and that factory was bound to cause major accidents in the future, and in spite of requests they were not given information and was considered to be, the government was considered to be liable. In another instance, the same thing, information was not given, uh, and accidents have happened due to and the community was not prepared to handle breaches or accidents. Likewise, there are several other case studies which we have highlighted in our paper. So, having seen what has happened in what's happening in the global angle as well as what's happening in India, there are some legal hurdles that we were able to identify to actual open access. One is the nature and quality of data, as in when there is a lot of public data, that is citizen created data, as well as data that's created by the government, there is often questions on the quality of this data, whether it is heterogeneous, whether it's conforming to one standard, and there is a huge volume of it which needs to be curated. So that is certainly a hurdle. Next is, of course, the intellectual property right aspect of it, especially when some data are considered as trade secrets or traditional knowledge, or if they are out of some patent information derived out of patents. So here, one needs to consider whether such information needs to be put up or not, and what are the safeguards to prevent information misappropriation. Regulating access to traditional knowledge is a major angle here, especially when you take information from communities. Do we have their consent? Are they okay with sharing of that information on a general context? Can you use that information for any respect, or are there some guidelines for it? So these are aspects under TK which need to be clarified before you make that information openly accessible. There is also considered to be a tussle between corporates and academics, especially when corporates invest a lot of funds into creating a lot of data, and academics who do this work almost for free. So usually coordination between the two is very hard to come by. And so when we create a database, it needs to be considered whether how they can bridge the gap. And next is, of course, misuse of publicly available data, where you can use it to snoop on somebody or to violate somebody's ethics or privacy. Some of the recommendations that we have proposed through this paper. One is to bring proper clarity to the national data sharing and accessibility policy. Uh, I mean, there are a lot of inconsistencies available in the policy as opposed to what is there in all the other laws. So that needs to be clarified. Nextly, of course, the privacy concerns with data sharing, where you don't violate anybody's privacy or ethics. That concern needs to be addressed maybe through user agreements or some such instrument. Uh, Operational policies should be developed on how to manage this data, how to make it more dynamic, and how to make it more standardized. The funding patterns, who's going to fund this project, all of these aspects should be covered within an operational policy, so that once a government database or any such database is created, it doesn't die a slow death due to lack of proper planning. Uh, there must be a potential for feedback from data users so that it can constantly be developed, constantly be improved. The data quality must be ensured. And there are several ways to do that, those must be addressed. A bottom up approach to data collection and dissemination, which is encouraging the public to bring in this information and collect it from ground up. This can help us cover a lot of information which is available in the really remote locations. Only communities can help you do that. Then there are a lot of legal precursors to data collection, like there are IPR rights and there are privacy concerns. These issues must be addressed. And lastly, of course, the IPR, intellectual property right concerns, which have been mentioned before, especially when it comes to patenting. When the data is openly accessible, how can a patent be created? Or if there are copyrights on such information, all of these concerns must be addressed. So these are some of our major suggestions and major observations on knowledge commons and the legal aspects, especially when it comes to environmental protection. I, Balakrishna sir, over to
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Shama. Actually, thank you very much. That colleagues would give you a quick overview of what the report contains. For all of those who have registered for this webinar, we have already shared a copy of the report. So you should have received a note to say that you can download the report through the GoToWebinar link. Otherwise, if any one of you are interested in having access to this particular report, you can please mail us on the mail addresses that are shared on your screen. Either to me or to Shama, we'll be more than happy to share a report with you. But having said that, let me contextualize points that I have made and also the elements of the report that we have prepared. So essentially, the precursor for preparing this report was a workshop that the Foundation for Ecological Security organized in Bangalore in November 2018, when we actually had a small working group that focused on the issue of data and information and how for decision making and for governance of resources, data and information as well as knowledge is extremely important. But for various reasons, both within developing countries as well as developed countries, having access to knowledge, information, and data is proving to be extremely challenging, not only because of lack of clarifications, lack of unified policies and frameworks, but because also a lot of misunderstanding and misapprehensions about what kind of data can be used, what kind of data can be shared, and what is the value of the data, and things like that. So when we started pulling this report together, one of a group of colleagues that I was in touch with are those who actually are working with the Convention on Biological Diversity. Many of you probably are familiar with this particular convention, which actually was born out of the UN Conference on Environment Development in 1992, along with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Desertification. This particular convention has an article that focuses on issues of traditional knowledge, Article 8J of the convention. And the convention's backbone is actually decision making based on data and information and knowledge related to biodiversity and ecosystems. So we have been implementing this particular convention since 1993 when it had come into effect. And we've just celebrated 25 years of this convention. And when there was a governing body meeting of this convention that happened in Egypt in November 2018, there was actually a special summit that was organized as a part of this particular governing body meeting, which was called the Summit on Culture and Biodiversity. And because of my association with the convention and the processes and the work that I've done on biodiversity, traditional knowledge, and related issues, I actually was requested by the Secretariat to be a part of a drafting team that actually developed a declaration on culture and biodiversity that was presented to the plenary session of the Conference of Parties of the governing body meeting. And when we were discussing during the Culture and Biodiversity Summit, as well as when we were drafting the declaration, I was strongly of the opinion to actually have a focus on the issue of commons. Commons in the context of resource management, the principles of commons or approaches in the context of knowledge, information, and data, And to my surprise, I really found that the community, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity focal points and the experts who participate in these processes, basically are not aware of the work of commons. The word or the terminology or the principles of commons have never been used or applied within this process. So politely, I was asked to refrain from having any reference into the Declaration on Commons, mainly because if you, as you know, in any international discussion, especially led by UN, if you're introducing new terminologies and new phraseologies, the first thing that will happen is to have a negotiation on the relevance of those kinds of terms and things, which may actually delay the process of adopting the declaration. So basically, I had to agree and compromise that we will not use the word commons anywhere in the declaration, but at least a couple of principles related to that would be incorporated into the declaration. But that really made me think on how much we actually are missing within the context of the convention and its processes, not mainstreaming the ideas, the understanding, the results, and the approaches that so far for decades people have worked on the ground, people have done elaborate research on commons, and as I mentioned before, we have even had a Nobel Prize for economics on the issue of commons. But unfortunately, here is an intergovernmental international platform that decides on the future of resource management, especially ecosystems and biodiversity and associated traditional knowledge, that actually doesn't even know that there is this concept of knowledge, or still have reluctance in terms of looking at the elements and principles of the commons. So one of the things that we are now doing is to engage with the convention colleagues who are actually participating in the negotiations of the convention, as well as the parties and agencies who are supporting the negotiation process, in terms of making them understand some of these things. For example, as and when we are discussing in the next 13 to 14 months, countries are going to be developing a global framework for conservation, sustainable use, and also sharing the benefits of sustainable use in a fair and equitable manner. A global biodiversity framework that will be adopted by 196 countries in November 2020 in China. So currently countries actually are pulling together a global strategic plan for biodiversity and also a set of targets to support achieving the strategic plan. And the very fundamental basis for much of these negotiations are pulling together the framework, which is a strategic plan for the convention, is going to be biodiversity data and biodiversity information. So if we do not understand the principles, and if we do not understand the kind of opportunities and the challenges we have in terms of democratization of data and information, especially in the context of knowledge commons, certainly that particular process of developing the next 10-year strategic plan for global biodiversity conservation and associated traditional knowledge is going to run into a lot of implementation challenges. The second part of it is that given that knowledge and information and data is generated to a large extent also from the public and citizen, and an increasing focus on the involvement of local people and citizens and communities in achieving the biodiversity targets, it is very important that we also focus on the issue of democratization of knowledge, democratization of information and data as well. And that is why what we are now trying to do, both FES and FLEDGE, is to continue this particular conversation, continue engaging with colleagues from the convention community, as well as come up with more case studies, more convincing arguments that there is relevance to understanding knowledge commons as a basic and fundamental principle in terms of developing our future global strategic plan and a set of global targets for conserving biological diversity and associated traditional knowledge. So the next webinar, where we will be announcing the dates fairly soon, would focus on elevating some of these principles, some of these results and understanding into a global discussion platform, where we are planning to organize a webinar with the Secretariat of the Convention, with UNDP, FAO, and UNEP, and other international players who have got a significant role to play in shaping the global negotiations, in terms of making them understand and request mainstreaming some of these principles and results into the discussions as they happen. So that's basically the ideas, the results of the work that we have done, and some follow-up actions that I'd like to share with all of you who are online and those who have registered to be a part of the webinar. And several of the requests have come in terms of recording of the webinar to be made available for those colleagues who could not join us physically during this particular time for various reasons. We'll definitely make the recording available fairly soon as it is edited and made available. And with those points, I'm opening up the screen for any questions, comments, and inputs you have. You have two options. One, you can raise your hands through a hand signal that you can see on your screens, or you can also type your question under the chat box that I'll read the question and appropriately we'll try and answer the question. Of course, if you have questions after this particular webinar, you're more than welcome to send us an email and we'll be more than happy to engage with you and expand the network and the alumni of those who are interested to work on the issue of commons. Thank you very much. The floor is now open for questions, comments, and inputs.